the Central Mass Regional Planning and the town of Sutton applied for a grant to work on housing study a while ago, and we got that grant, which is great. And so we're here tonight in the midst of this process. One of the reasons we're working on housing is because of this lovely plan. If you've participated in this many years ago, this is the town's master plan. And for those who participated in the master plan process, goals and objectives came out of this process. And the objectives in the housing section were to provide support for a variety of housing types, to promote housing that is compatible with community character and context, to integrate affordable housing throughout the community, and to move toward meeting the state's required 10% affordable housing goal. So this process is really aimed at meeting every single one of these objectives from the master plan. And Ron Barron from Central Mass Regional Planning and Emily Glovitz from Central Mass Regional Planning are going to talk to you about how we're going to do that and why we're going to do that. And with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you guys. And I will only interject if somebody asks a question that you can't answer.
You said it's the master plan.
The master plan was, these are 20 to 25 year plans, 2012 was the last master plan. And there's a lot of goals and objectives, so it takes us a while to get to some of those goals. So we're just getting to housing now.
Well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate everybody coming out tonight. Again, my name is Ron Barron with the Central Massachusetts Regional Planning Commission. I do mostly housing and economic development and some bylaw work here. I got in with this project. By the way, this is going to be a less formal conversation than it seems tonight. We're just sitting at this desk largely because we couldn't think of a place where we could stand and not block your view of the projector. So feel free to ask questions, chime in if you need clarification on anything. We'll be happy to be interrupted and answer any questions. Just want to give a quick overview of what we're going to be doing tonight. We're going to have a presentation that's going to talk a bit about how we got to this project, what our goals are, what sort of data that we've collected to date, sort of what the function is and the purpose of this kind of a plan, and how we move forward. After that, we're going to have a very short break, and then we're going to move on to a breakout group activity that we would like to do. We've got maps in the back room, and we're going to have one up here. And what we're going to do is we're going to ask everyone who is participating tonight to look at those maps and look at some different types of housing that we have. We have samples of different housing types. And let you give us your feedback on what you think would be appropriate in various parts of town, why you don't think it's appropriate, why you do think it's appropriate, etc. After that, we're going to have a little bit of a report. We're going to talk about it, see what everybody's feedback was, and then that will be it for tonight. Hopefully, this will not take longer than 2 hours. I know it's pretty late. Nobody wants to stay here for that long, so we'll try to go through this as quickly as possible. What we're trying to get out tonight is with this presentation, we would like everyone who sits through this to have a better understanding of what housing plans are, why they're important, how having a housing plan or not having a housing plan can end up impacting residents in communities. What we mean by affordable, because that's something that is important to define, just so people can understand exactly what we're trying to achieve with these, and how the existence or the lack of housing that is considered affordable can impact the community. We also want to talk a little bit about the types of options you can have for achieving the goals that the master plan has set out. We also want everyone to understand what the goals of the project is, the timeline for achieving it, and what we hope to get out of it. And finally, get some of your vision, some of your feedback from the breakout activity and any questions you have, so that we'll be able to know when we're crafting recommendations off this. We want to be able to do something that the town is going to be able to get behind and is going to have some buy-in. And we'll talk a little bit of how the project has unfolded thus far. So a little bit about the background. Obviously, as Jen said, that this is building off of the master plan, which was completed in 2012. It's a townwide 20-year plan. Jen's already talked about what the objectives are, so I won't reiterate those. When we started this project, we got information on a grant opportunity that became available around October. It was about this time last year. It was a state grant, and the real object of this grant is that it's money specifically earmarked for towns that have plans, that have actionable items. They were providing technical assistance to actually take some of these items and make them happen. Because one of the things that's the biggest frustration in this field is lots of people make plans and then the plans go and they sit on a shelf and nothing happens and nothing ever changes. So this is a rare bit of money that was actually the state provided to get something done at the town level. So what they wanted is they wanted towns that already had master plans that had sort of vaguely formed goals and objectives. And then we wanted to be able to dig into those and come up with some things that we could actually take and become real reforms. Like maybe take a bylaw that can go to town meeting, policy change, all number of things can come out of this. So the first thing that we're going to do is, we've been working on developing a housing needs analysis and a comprehensive housing plan that's going to come out of that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what those are. The general goals of this project is to produce the comprehensive housing plan, which is a plan that can be submitted to the DHCD, it's the Department of Housing and Community Development. Mm-hmm. Yes. I always forget that acronym. And what, again, as I said, this was intended to try to generate a meaningful policy change or a meaningful bylaw change that will actually have impact and help a town better reach its goals as far as housing is concerned. Another goal of this is to help Sutton get to this safe harbor piece. We're going to talk a little bit about 40B in a second, and this is the law that this housing plan is meant to address, and what this safe harbor regulation is referring to. So, little overview of what a comprehensive housing plan is. Under Chapter 40B in the state law, if you're not familiar with it, every town in Massachusetts is required to have a minimum 10% of its housing stock deemed affordable by state standards. Right now, Sutton is at 1.5%. Most of the CMRPC region is in not quite close to 10%. There's a few communities that are at 10% or higher. The way that's calculated is the state will look at your population, the number of units in town, and then the number of units that are deemed affordable on their state subsidized housing inventory, or SHI, that they keep. And then that'll generate the number that determines whether or not a town is at that 10% threshold or not. And what happens if you're not at that 10% threshold, if your subsidized housing inventory is not at that level, is that there's a process that the state provides for developers to bypass local zoning controls. This is the comprehensive permit process. An individual who wants to build something can come in, and if it doesn't meet local zoning regulations, they can appeal it and appeal it and appeal it and appeal it and eventually get to the state level. And we have a little chart that'll kind of go through that. And essentially, if the state looks at your SHI and they say you're not at 10%, they will allow development to go through even if it doesn't meet local standards. There's very few controls you can have at that point. So what safe harbor is, and this is one of the things that you get out of having a comprehensive housing plan. Safe harbor basically means there are certain areas in the law, there's certain criteria you can meet where the state will look at, when it's looking at a comprehensive permit, it will look at what the town has done, what its goals are, what kind of good faith efforts the town has made to increase affordable housing in their communities, and they can give either a 12-month or a 24-month window where they'll be able to deny a comprehensive permit. The state won't intervene. If you say you don't want a 40B development, the state won't go around you and make you do it anyways. And there's a few different ways that you can get that. One is you have to have a comprehensive housing plan, or housing production plan as they call it. We like to use the term comprehensive housing plan because we actually think A, it's more accurate, and B, it doesn't have the word production in it. It's, makes it a little bit more palatable. But we have done these where we've called them comprehensive housing plans. We've developed them in the same criteria as a housing production plan, and we've submitted them to the state, they've accepted them, and it's wonderful. So if you do have this and you have numerical goals, you set goals in the plans for developing new housing, and you're able to meet certain criteria, and they're very low criteria, you can, as long as you're developing up to 1/2 of 1% of your goals every year, they will give you a 12-month extension. You'll give you a 12-month safe harbor. If you get up to 1%, they'll give you a 24-month safe harbor during the life of that plan. And as long as you're making progress, they will continue to keep you in that range. So even if you're not at the 10%, if you're making progress towards the 10%, then you can continue to get these safe harbor periods where a unfriendly, hostile development, they call them unfriendly 40Bs or hostile 40Bs, wouldn't be able to come into town and bypass local regulation. So essentially, the housing plan it's really a way for towns, as I've written it on this slide, it's a way for towns to add badly needed middle income housing in a controlled way that preserves the character and aesthetic of the town. It allows you to decide when and how affordable units get built, and helps preserve local control and local standards in a way that 40B does not on its own. It helps give you a buffer against the comprehensive permit process. And if you have the comprehensive housing plan in place, you can achieve this. If you don't, then you can be open to pretty aggressive development. This slide is just a very quick overview of the comprehensive permitting process. If a developer that has at least 25% affordable set aside in any development they're making comes to a town, and even if it's a large tower or something that would not normally be allowed by zoning board, the planning board would look at it and say, you can't do this. They would take it to the ZBA. If the ZBA approves it, great. If they don't, then they can take it to the Housing Appeals Committee. That's at the state level, and then the state will look at it. And the things that they will look at is they will look, okay, is the town at its 10% threshold? If not, they'll look to see if there's a housing production plan. If there isn't, or if there is, they'll look to see if they are in safe harbor, et cetera. And then as long as there's very minimal criteria that the state will look at to deny a big development. It would have to be something that would have a tremendous impact on the environment, or very few things that will trip up a 40B once it gets to that point, especially if there's a lot of housing pressure, population growth pressure in the region or surrounding the town. So I just want to talk a little bit about what we mean by affordable when we talk about this. When we talk about affordability in terms of Chapter B, I'll start by talking about what it's not. It's not Section 8 housing. It could be, but it's not necessarily Section 8 housing. That's not what we're talking about. It's not necessarily high-rise apartments. It's not something that will necessarily start to immediately tank the values of homes. These aren't really the kinds of things where you're seeing nuisance populations coming in. These are things that are based on a fairly conservative qualification for income. Housing affordability at the state level is defined by an individual earning 80% or less of the area median income. The way that's defined is there's a certain geography, and unfortunately I didn't look it up. We were asked earlier, we had a meeting earlier, and they asked me what the geography was, and I said I'd look it up, and I forgot to, so I apologize for that. But for the Sutton area, that area median income is currently $68,000 for a family of 4. So 80% of that is about $54,000 a year in income. So it's not a tremendous amount of income, considering how affluent the community is. It's substantially lower than you'd see sort of at the town's median income, but it's still it's a working family, it's a working class income. It's the kind of income that you'd see a lot of professionals having. Just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the data that we've collected so far. Obviously, Sutton is a fairly wealthy community. Sutton, the majority of the population, at least according to the census data from 2016, is in the $50,000 to $150,000 range. But still, 15% of the population falls in that 50 to 74,000, which is right about where the AMI affordability guidelines are. So 15% of the population could instantly qualify for the kind of affordable housing that we're talking about. And what we've seen as far as population growth is that the town has been growing, but albeit slowly. When you look at the trends, one of the things this slide has is it has the trends of population growth from 1930 to 2010. But that only tells one part of the story. So the slide underneath, this population growth index, is something that we put together. That what it is it's sort of an aggregate of all of the projected population growth that is going to occur in the CMRPC region based on internal population projections that we do for the state. And what it is this is showing essentially the share of population growth that's going to be absorbed by each town. So, for instance, Sutton is showing it's about 6% of the overall population growth that we're expecting to see in the next, I think it was 20 years, is going to be absorbed by Sutton. And that's not necessarily a good or a bad thing, but when you look at some of your neighbors, like Grafton is looking at absorbing almost 21% of the population growth in that same period, you can see that having neighbors that are going to be growing at a much faster rate is likely to put development pressures on the town, because a lot of that growth is going to want to come down. You're actually in a better position than Grafton is as far as highways are concerned because of 146. And the town has been seeing less market activity during the same period than Grafton or some other towns. So there's definitely the possibility that developers are going to look at these numbers, they're going to look at the population growth, and they're going to say this is a town that we could develop, that we could definitely build in. So when we look at some of the demographics, we also looked at the median age, and one of the things that this slide is showing is we wanted to try to look at how much the gap between the median age in Sutton and the median age in the county and at the state level, and how they've been separating over the years. And right now the median age in Worcester County is 39.9, the median age in Sutton is 44. And at the state level, it's 39. So it's about the same as it is in Worcester County as a whole. So when we look at the incomes, we look at the age group, the age gap, and some of the other data that we're seeing, what it's really telling us is that there's not a lot of new young families that are coming in, and the people that are here tend to be older, tend to be more affluent. The people that are moving in you have to be older and upper middle class in order to really afford a house in Sutton. I looked at it this afternoon at some of the housing market data. I looked at Zillow, which actually has a remarkable, pretty good data set that you can look at. And they were showing that the median listing price for houses in Sutton right now is almost $450,000. And when we talk about the area median income, this target for affordable, if you think of somebody with a $54,000 family income, what they could afford is probably around $200,000, $210,000, and that would be stretching it. So it's a big gap between what people in the middle income range can afford and what's actually here. And as far as unit growth, this slide is illustrating how many new housing units have been added over the last few years. And as we can see, since 2000, the number of units has slowed down over the years. The peak was about 150 units added in 2000, and then by now we've been averaging between about 30 to 50 units a year towards the tail end of this period. Now the growth is still about 8.5%, or about 8%, and compared to Grafton, Northridge, you're about middle of the pack for the areas the towns that are around the 146 corridor. But again, because there's so much more growth going on in Grafton, there's so much more growth going on in Northbridge, then you're going to see pressure, or you have the potential to see pressure from developers to build in town. So far, it seems like you've managed to have a pretty good handle on the rate of growth, but as the population goes up, and I did just read this afternoon that there was a new study that came out that is saying that the population of the Worcester metro area is in the next, I think they said the next 20 years is supposed to go up by more than 9%. And we're going to have, I think they said 1,025,000 people in the region in the next 20 years, which was startling to me. I didn't see that coming. And so we wanted to ask the question as part of this is, what if a town does nothing? So we wanted to look at a couple of samples of cases where this did happen, where towns had to fight for it, and Emily had looked into this, and we have three case studies. We have a couple of case studies that she was going to talk about.
Yeah. So I wanted to look at a few towns that are kind of similar to Sutton in a lot of ways, and see. I chose ones that had been kind of negligent about building affordable housing, which left them vulnerable to developers coming in and building these large affordable housing units. So the first one was the town of Wellesley. It's one of the wealthiest towns in the Commonwealth. The recent statistics says a median cost of a home is now at $980,000, which is incredible. So a developer, this was over 10 years ago, came in, proposed an 87-unit mixed income rental housing on just a little over 2-acre site. A lot of people in the community were not happy about this. There was worries about the density of the building, concerns about traffic, stress on sewer and water, how would that impact their schools. There's just a number of things. So while that was, the proposal was rejected at the ZBA, it just ended up going to the Supreme Judicial Court, which allowed the developer to have the permits necessary because they didn't have hardly any affordable housing. So it just ended up being this long, 6 to 10 year battle between the developer and the town, back and forth. Luckily, the town ended up being really involved in the project in the end when they realized they couldn't reject it anymore. So they built what is not the ugliest building ever. They were able to kind of put their input in about the form and location a little bit, and they ended up bringing the number of units down to 52. So that's just one example of the town does nothing. The next one is Walpole. It's over near Foxborough and Gillette Stadium. It's been growing in population and median household income since the late 1980s. It's a bedroom community pretty close to Boston and Providence, so not unlike Sutton, which is close to Worcester, Providence, Boston as well. So in this case, the developer appealed the denial of a comprehensive permit for a mixed income development at the state Housing Appeals Committee. So it didn't go quite to the Supreme Judicial Court, but the state one. So this one is a lot bigger. It consists of 300 apartment units in 13 buildings across 42 acres. So the town had this this plot of land, which they had hoped to be used for commercial development because they're so close to Gillette Stadium, but they ended up not being able to use that for what they had originally wanted. So the developer was able to get the comprehensive permit. So a little dismaying for the town there. So these are just examples of if the town does nothing, these developers will be able to go through with these developments. Next one. So there's a few options that are available. So there's something called Friendly 40B. So the developer would be able to work cooperatively with the town boards to minimize density, improve setbacks, and just kind of blend the aesthetics of these buildings with the character of the neighborhood. So you'll be more involved. I believe there's a few town-owned properties that,
We have one friendly 40B, that's Leland Hill Estates. That was not town-owned property. We definitely have town-owned property where you would have a lot of control if you develop on town-owned property. But our only friendly 40B is Leland Hill Estates, where the Zoning Board of Appeals was able to work with the developer. The lots were much smaller, they made them bigger. It's still a pretty dense neighborhood, but the architectural form is a lot better than what was originally proposed. So, and the selectmen actually have to sign off initially on the developer's proposal and that the town commits to working with the developer and vice versa. We still, in Sutton, we still hire a professional consultant who knows how to look at the financial statements of the developer and see where they're hiding money and kind of pull that apart. Our zoning board a number of years ago did a comprehensive permit review manual based on a state model and tweaked it for Sutton, and it does a great job on these friendly 40Bs. But as you pointed out, an unfriendly 40B can steamroll you. So it can be scary.
I think the other thing to point out too that when looking at these case studies that I was surprised to see is the amount of time it took to get through some of these developments and the amount of cost incurred to the towns, because a lot of that time, maybe not the entire 6 years, but a large chunk of that time, these towns were in court and fighting these things. And it's when it becomes hostile, it becomes something that can be a very big drain on resources. And there's very few things you can do to stop it other than win in court. And that's an expensive proposition for just about any town.
Other options include encouraging traditional neighborhood development in more parts of town. That involves kind of construction on undeveloped land. It can include a range of housing types, a network of connected streets and blocks, and public spaces or stores or schools. That's kind of just a general definition of traditional neighborhood development. Another one is encouraging modest multifamily units in suitable areas of town. So they don't have to be these big, scary, boxy developments, which are tend to be associated with affordable housing. So these are just, if you can see, there's a few pictures. We'll have an activity later that'll give you better ideas, show more pictures of different kinds of these housing. So there's traditional neighborhood development, which I just talked about on the left-hand side, as well as cluster development. So houses are constructed a lot closer together in order to preserve open space and environmental resources. And then on the right-hand side, they're kind of more larger. It's a small to medium scale apartments or condominiums. Just a couple examples. Just to give you an idea. The next one. So to give you an idea of the project timeline in the coming months, we started this project around June or July. It'll be wrapping up in 2019, the end of June. So we've got a bit more time to work on this, but there's also a lot we're trying to do. So by December 2018, coming up, we'll be wrapping up a housing needs analysis, looking at the data. We did a survey. We got 300 responses, which was awesome. We've been digging deep into the zoning and regulatory review to see what can really be done with the zoning there. And we're going to be putting together a recommendations report. And then from there, we'll go forward, hopefully, with a zoning bylaw change, which we can bring to town meeting in May 2019. So just keep tuned for another public workshop similar to this, where we can really work on the language of the bylaw and what's going to work for this town. And then a final report on recommendations and outcomes will be just kind of how this project will culminate, wrap everything up, and then that'll be available. And so we're hoping just to keep this a really interactive project. We're not hiding in a room somewhere looking up changes to make. And so hopefully give us a lot of feedback today, your thoughts, talk to your friends and family and neighbors, let them know what we're working on. We have a project website too, which will be on one of these last slides. So if you're interested, and we'll also be putting up these are the results of the survey that wrapped up last month, and also this slideshow. I think these videos will be available as well. So if anyone missed this, tell them to go to that website. And also goals. So just some general goals. We kind of already talked about this, but the idea would be to have a change in zoning, subdivision, or any other reform that can be taken to town meeting and hopefully passed. And yeah, so that would be an implementation of at least one recommendation from the report. And yeah, your input on this is crucial. This is your plan. This is your town. We're here to help.
So one of the things that we're gonna do tonight, and this is going back to the input piece, is the activity we wanna do is something where we wanna get everyone's feedback on types of housing that they're comfortable with, that you're not comfortable with, why you're not comfortable with it, et cetera. And one of the reasons we do these exercises is because we want to be able to gauge if we're going to try to recommend a change, what is going to make people comfortable, what is going to make people panic. You know, we want to know what people are, we want to be able to get a sense of what people are going to be able to support if we're going to do this. Is continuing as part of this process, when we get into the bylaw development stage, which is going to be happening next year, or policy implementation, whatever it is, it doesn't specifically have to be a bylaw, but it's something that we have to have an actionable item that's going to be, that we're going to implement. The town is actually going to try to put into place. There will be additional hearings, there will be opportunities for input, and so anybody who left their email on the sign-in sheet, we're going to put that into a database. We're going to email out everybody who's attended tonight and let them know when anything has changed, when any other meetings are coming up, and anybody who did the survey. And if anybody in the room did the survey, thank you. Appreciate that. So I'd like to open up the floor now for questions. I know we haven't had too many yet, and then we'll talk about the activity after that. So,
Does the state mandate to the town of Sutton when we have to reach the 10% affordable housing threshold?
there's no deadline for meeting that.
Periodically review to see how we're doing?
Yeah, so what they'll do is every 10 years, they base the percentage on the population from the last census, and then they look at the housing count that's from the most recent estimates, and then look at the subsidized housing inventory. And that's what's being, every time somebody comes in to town and wants to have a deed restricted unit, they have to come to town, they fill out an application, they fill out a form, and then that goes to the state and it gets recorded in the inventory. And so they keep track of it that way. As far as the goals of the achieving safe harbor, what the state will do is if you've got a registered comprehensive housing plan, they'll look at that when somebody comes in or whenever you get another unit that gets added to your inventory. And then they'll see, okay, how much of progress are they making on that? And that's what they'll use to determine whether or not you're meeting the good faith goals that they have set in the law.
Thank you.
How many units is compliance in Sutton?
I'm sorry?
How many units would be compliant? How many more units would we need?
Would you need to get there? Well, right now you have 50, and what did we figure back of the envelope calculation was like
360.
360, yeah. So if you got one really gigantic apartment complex, because that's one of the things that is good about apartments that a lot of people don't realize is that if you get an apartment complex that has, again, I was supposed to look that up and I didn't, but it's like a 10 or 15, it's like a 10 or 20% set aside minimum for affordable units in an apartment complex. The state will count the entire unit, the entire building as part of your inventory. So if you had a 300 unit apartment complex, which I'm not saying you should have, but if you did, and they had that 10%, then you meet your goal right there. But again, it's a moving target to a certain degree because we're getting to the next census period. And if you did get to your 10%, the census numbers would come out and then you drop back down below your 10%. So, you know, to a certain degree, you're sort of chasing it. But I mean, that's part of the problem with population growth in general. Did anyone else have any questions? Yes.
How many actual responses did you get and how many mailings did you make?
How many mailings? We made one mailing to the entire town.
How many people did you send out?
We sent out 3,000. We sent out mailings to about 3,600 households, so about every household in town.
Mm-hmm.
And our response rate was from 300 households, so we got about a 7%. Was the one we did the calculation. It might have been more than 36. It might have been 39.
Yeah, because there was a few P.O. boxes there as well that we sent them out.
That were business P.O. boxes that didn't count.
Yeah.
You couldn't single out business as opposed to residential P.O. boxes, so.
Mm-hmm.
So you're basing all your decisions on an extremely small amount of people in the town and responses.
Well, when you're planning, you do your best. You do your best. You don't not plan because people choose not to participate. When we have gone kind of above and beyond on this one, going to the newspapers, sending out notice to every household in the town, being out on cable, being out on websites, speaking at the senior center. We've kind of gone to every avenue we pretty much can, except for knocking on everybody's door and handing them the postcard that came in the mail, to try to get people involved. You can't force people to be involved. So, and we can't stop planning because people don't want to be involved. We have real issues we have to deal with that will affect the town as a whole, even if only 7% of the households in this town think it's important enough to be involved. So, you're right, it's a low number. It's not quite statistically significant. We wanted to get to 10%, but one of the things Ron didn't point out is when you compare the demographic chart of the town with the demographic chart of those who responded, there's almost a direct correlation. So even though it's only 7% of the town, proportionately, those who responded match percentage-wise pretty much that population town-wide in terms of income, age, those kind of things.
And I think if I could just add something to that, it's important to point out that we are operating off a very small percentage of the population, but it's not accurate to say that we're making decisions off that. We're making recommendations. The town is going to make the decisions. Anything that comes out of this is going to go before the town and will be acted on. There's very few things that would come out of this process, very few recommendations that would be things that could be acted on without town input, either from the Board of Selectmen or at town meeting. It would need to be adopted at a certain point where there's going to be town input at every point. So we're not actually making any decisions. We're trying to read the tea leaves as best we can, so to speak, try to come up with recommendations that we think will meet both the state mandates and the sense that the town has given us of what they would like, and thread that needle as best we can. But ultimately, it's going to be up to the town to make the decision to act on anything that comes out of this process.
Right.
Any other questions?
I think maybe you answered this, I'm not sure. So the next time we get looked at isn't during the next census, every 10 years? And will the next one be in 2020? Is that how they do it?
Well, they look at the number on a rolling basis. So every time a new subsidized unit gets reported to the state, they look at the numbers and they look at what actions the town has taken.
Okay.
But the population numbers they use as sort of the baseline to set that 10% calculation is based on the census. They don't look at the rolling American Community Survey data that comes out. So they won't have taken into account any population growth that has happened between 2010 and say today. If a new affordable deed restricted unit went on and we submitted it to the state, they wouldn't look at any of those population growth numbers. They'd use the two. But then when we get to the next census in 2020, they're gonna look at those new numbers and that will become the new floor, so to speak. So that's the baseline that'll establish that. And when the population, all of that population growth that has happened between then and now is now going to be reflected in their numbers in 2010. So that's where the census comes in.
And when we were doing this process, the 3,600 I talked to you about, that's not the census number. The census number was like 3,400. When we're thinking about it, we're trying to think in the most recent numbers we know, and that's closer to 3,600 than the 3,400. We don't want to, they want to operate 10 years behind, we'd rather not.
All right, so we would like to do this activity. Anybody who is interested in participating in this, what we will do is break into 3 groups. We've got 3 maps right now. One of the groups will be at this desk. We're going to reorganize it so that people could actually sit at it. And there's 2 other maps in the back that people, if you want to just filter on over there, we'd appreciate it. I'll be at one, Jen will be at one. Will you do another?
Yeah, sure, I'll take it.
Okay. And we'll talk about how this is going to go. What we have is that we have a number of images that depict different types of affordable housing that come from other like types of 40B developments, and really just more middle income type housing types like traditional neighborhood developments, cluster developments, etc. And we have the big maps of the town, and what we're gonna wanna do is we want everybody to give your input, number one, on what types of housing you like, why you don't like it, why you do like it, etc. And then where in town you think each one would be most appropriate. And then from that, we will be able to take that data, look at the zoning in these areas and the other policies, and then we can start coming up with recommendations that would come out of this process. So.
As I cautioned the last time we did this, the base maps that we use different mapping layers. So not everything you see represented on the maps is perfect. So you'll see a legend, you'll see what the legend represents. It's pretty good, it's not perfect. So try not to get too hung up on all of the categories. I can go after I kind of work with my group for a few minutes, I can quickly come to the other groups and point out what's obviously a little off about the maps, but.
Yeah, I'll tell you right now, there's a bunch of things that are flagged as mixed use, and it turns out that they're almost all farms. So I don't know if that was my error or something funny about the way the assessor's data is collected, but, so if you see it and it's a farm and it's flagged mixed use, don't panic. You're not being taxed incorrectly or anything, it's just, that's just how it showed up on the map.
Right,
So,
right, so yeah.
there was one gentleman who came in who was like, that's my farm.
Right, and there was another person that was like, this is not commercial, and it's like, you're right. This much commercial and this much residential free. So, but yeah, so there are always interesting glitches when you look at maps, so
But also
don't get too hung up on that.
if you do see anything that's just glaringly wrong, let somebody know, because we can always fix it. Because, our maps are only as good as the data set we have, so if there's something wrong in the data set, it's gonna be wrong on the map, so.
And
I take issue to that. I'm on the Board of Assessors, and our data is correct. It's your maps that are wrong.
Well,
I think the
but-
layer
yeah.
we're using is, one of them's an assessor's map layer, but there's EOEA layers and the like, so.
Well, we are basing it off the state, the assessor's data that comes through the state. So I don't know how up to date that is. It may be just that it's out of date and we haven't gotten the most up to date layer. I'm not sure. But we can talk about that later if you know of any serious corrections that we can make. Because we really want it to be accurate.
For people that might want to be involved or watching this at home or something like that, how would they, if they have a concern or a question, or what would be the best way for them to reach out and make sure that their input was taken into account during the process? I mean, obviously time is of the essence, and
Absolutely.
people need to respond quickly,
Right.
but how would you
So,
suggest they communicate?
Central Mass Regional Planning has a link on their site, but we have had a link on the town's planning board page since we started this process. You can call the town hall, talk to the planning department, that would be me. Or you can email me. You just have to reach out with a phone call or an email and express yourself. Every comment that we receive is taken and it's taken seriously, and we put it into the mix. As with almost any plan, including this one, not everybody's gonna love everything in every plan, but we try to really reflect in our plans, in our actions, in our bylaws, kind of where the majority of people who chose to participate are kind of going and thinking with things. The main part of what we're trying to do here tonight, and every time we do a planning process, is to kind of give you all the facts we can, educate everybody about the process as much as we can, and then just hear what you have to say. Because that's the foundation of every decent plan. So do you want me to count off 1, 2, 3? Or can you split into about 3 groups that are roughly 6 people? I think it's
You wanted to do 1, 2, 3. 1 potato, 2 potato.